My name is Armin, I'm a product specialist at Notch, and in this tutorial we will talk about a render layer node and its use for virtual productions. The render layer node renders all of its child nodes and their subtrees to a separate composition layer within the scene. When used in virtual production projects, the composite output position property allows you to choose if the render is positioned on the left or right hand side of the screen, akin to frontplate backplate setups. Frontplate and backplate setups are a way for a designer to define what elements will be visible on LED screens and what elements are going to be shown and composited into the broadcast feed as augmented reality while containing it all in one coherent scene. When preparing a virtual production scene in Notch, the designer has to define what is the front plate and what is the back plate. And that is done by sending the signal to the left and to the right, thus arranging backplate to one side and front plate to the other. From there on, Media Server can take over this arrangement and distribute the signal to the front plate and the back plate accordingly in its internal system. In this example, we have backplate and front plate set up to render side by side in full double HD width in the viewport. This is done just so we can see better what is happening. When we are working on our designs, we don't need to double up our resolution in width for it to be read correctly by Media Server. Bespoke Media Server will do this calculation automatically internally, so you can keep your original scene settings at all times. So with that said, I'm going to change the current resolution to a more conventional 16:9, 1920x1080 resolution. So I'm going to go for Project, Settings, Rendering, and I will type in 1920 on the width. And now I will head to the root and I'm going to change the output render layer side by side to output composite. For the purposes of this tutorial, I will be using this template, and you can find this template whenever you turn on Notch. So when you're greeted with a hello screen, make sure to go to templates and scroll to the bottom. You will find virtual production simple template. So this is exactly what you see in front of you now. Instead of talking about all these nodes here in the scene, I think we should start things a little bit more simple, and we're going to add render layer and all the appropriate extra nodes as we progress. So I'm going to find the very same scene, but without the render layer. And let's talk about the nodes that we have available for us here. So we have a camera, we're looking through this camera right now. We have one spotlight, we have skylight, and we have several 3D objects. Here we have a human model, and here we have two walls and a floor. A little bit further down, we have a box, which is 1 meter by 1 meter size, and we have two text nodes stating Notch Virtual Production Template. So I think we can start things by putting these two text nodes under render layer. So I'm going to grab render layer now. I will connect it to the root, and I will disconnect these two text nodes, and I'm going to connect them through render layer. As mentioned in the beginning of the tutorial, render layer puts everything in a separate rendering path, so we can preview that in the viewport. So now these two text nodes are rendered separately on a separate path. I can further illustrate that by adding a tint node. Notice what happens when I apply the tint node to the render layer. Only the nodes connected to the render layer gets the red tint. The opposite happens if I connect it to the root. So let's talk about different properties that we have in a render layer node. So the first option we have is layer blend modes. There's quite a few to choose from, but for this tutorial we'll stick with blend with alpha channel. Property beneath layer blend mode is alpha, so we can fade in and fade out all the contents of the render layer using this slider right here. After the alpha, we have composition order, so should we have more than one render layer, we can define how are they stacking and what is the consecutive order of them being rendered in the scene. Further down the line, we have on-depth buffer. So this property right here makes sure that all the contents of render layer is rendered on top of everything else in the scene. In our case, since we're preparing this for the virtual production, this is definitely a needed tick box, so I'm going to go ahead and tick that on. Now I can be certain that anything connected to the render layer will be in front of any other items that are in the scene. Next property in render layer is deferred lighting enabled. So this is quite self-explanatory, just like we have deferred lighting on the root node. We have an option to turn it on and off for the render layer as well. There might be instances where you're working with something very simple like a 2D image. In that case, you probably wouldn't need deferred lighting, but since we're working with the 3D scene, this is definitely needed, so I'm going to leave it on. Further down the line, we have composite output position, so we can choose should it be composited to the left or right. In this case, we want to send our front plate arrangements to the right hand side, so I'm going to choose that. We don't see any impact just yet, and that is because we need to go back to the root node and change the output render layer side by side property from no output composite to output side by side. All of a sudden, we see that a render layer is being rendered on the right hand side. Of course, we can choose to send it back to the left, but we're going to keep it on the right hand side. As mentioned in the beginning of the tutorial, Media Server would understand this arrangement and it would distribute the signal as two 16:9ers side by side. So we're not obliged to add width to our viewport, that is just not needed. In most cases, while working with the virtual productions, you likely will be looking at the setup as a composite. But for the purposes of making this tutorial more clear, I'm going to go for the project, settings, and I'm going to add some width to my arrangement. So I'm going to make sure that we have double the HD in width. There we go. So now we definitely see the backplate and front plate arranged side by side. So let's come back to the list of available properties in render layer. We can change the background color. In majority of cases, you likely will just keep it black or alpha. And then we have different ways of previewing our render layer in the viewport. So we can start by previewing the contents, then we can see the RGB values, and of course we can see the alpha values too. You may have noticed that there's two inputs here on the side of render layer. So first one is affecting lights and the second one is excluded lights. So let's grab the spotlight and let's pipe it to the excluded lights property. As you see, this light now is excluded from the render layer. So the very opposite operation would be affecting lights. So you may choose to use one or the other in accordance to your design. By default, a render layer will take advantage of all the lights that are available in the scene. So the next thing that I would like to cover in this tutorial is color treatment. I'm going to grab a LUT that I have here in the resources and I'm going to connect it to the root. And now you can see that the color LUT is applied on the back plate, but it's not affecting the render layer setup. So the front plate is not working with this color LUT. In order for both back and front plate to have the same color grade, I have to grab a copy of this color LUT and connect it to render layer. Now, if I go to the root now and I change the output render layer side by side to a output composite, you will notice that by adding an extra color LUT, not only I applied it on the render layer, but I doubled up its influence because it's stacking twice on the render layer and on the root setup. So how do we fix that? Well, in every single color grade related node in Notch, we have two properties. The first one is apply to solid geometry only. I'm going to tick that on. And more importantly, apply to filled pixels only. So now we're not applying this LUT to the whole area of render layer. We're only applying this LUT where we have geometry filling the pixels. So this evens out the values and makes these color LUTs work hand in hand, delivering one coherent design. I'm going to switch back side-by-side view now. When working with virtual productions and backplate and frontplate, you might find yourself in a situation where you're not sure if the object should be in the backplate or frontplate. To address this issue, we have a separate node that helps out. That node is called Select a Render Layer for Child Nodes. So I'm going to bring that to the scene. I will connect it to the root. And I will grab this 3D box and I will pipe it through Select a Render Layer. There we go. And not much changed. And that is because I haven't defined what kind of a render layer should this Select Render Layer node work with. So I will grab this render layer and I will pipe it into the first input render layers. So now the setup is complete and the cube jumped from the back plate to the front plate. It jumped because we have an active property. When this node is set to inactive property, it is rendering through root straight to the shape 3D box. And once it's activated, it's thinking that this node, shape 3D box, is connected to the render layer. So basically this is a switch. Either it renders to the backplate, hence connected to the root, or it renders as a part of the render layer, thus to the front plate. So let's cover the rest of the properties that we have in a Select Render Layer for Child nodes. The second property we have here is modes, and we can choose either we see the children in the selected layer, or we can see them in both layers at the same time. I'm going to switch it back to children visible in selected layer. Then we have camera clip plane mode. I'm going to set it to in front. So now we have a slider that defines us where is the clipping happening. So this property defines at what distance should the object be sent to the backplate or front plate. Using modifiers, you could attach this property to your camera if you desire to keep it dynamic. I will further illustrate this clipping property by adding a sphere that is going to be turning around the center of this scene around this human. So I'm going to start off by adding a null. I will connect it to the select render layer. This will be my pivot point, and I will add a 3D primitive shape 3D. So now I want the shape 3D to be a little bit higher and in front of the object. And now as I will change the values in the heading, you will see that it's clipping either to the front or the back plate. Let's add a continuous modifier so we can see this animating. There we go. And let's attach it to the heading property. Let's give it a little bit more speed. And now as you see, as soon as it hits the set clip point, it either goes to the back plate or the front plate, depending on where we set that clip point. There might be instances where you will need more precision sending things to the backplate or front plate. For that, you can use bounds. So there's an input for a bound box. And by using this bound box, you can actually define where and what should be sent to the front or backplate, depending on the position of the bound box. Once you're done with your design and you are ready to send it out to a media server, make sure to double check the composite blend mode. In my case, it's already set to blend with alpha channel. By default, it's set to blend. Now, notice what happens if I preview the alpha of the composite blend mode set to blend. We do not contain alpha in this setting, so always double check and make sure that your composite blend mode is set to blend with alpha channel. As you see now, we definitely have alpha and we can composite these two things one on top of the other. So let's cover the most important points of this tutorial. First of all, make sure that you have render layer in scene and you have all the objects that you want to send to the front plate attached to the render layer. If you are not certain if one or the other item should be sent to the front plate or back plate, you can always use select render layer for child nodes to define that. In render layer, make sure to tick on depth buffer and deferred lighting if you are requiring a little bit more elaborate 3D work. Choose the left or right hand side for your front plate. And if you are using color grade, make sure to tick on apply to filled pixels only for the best results. And of course, as mentioned before, always double check if your composite blend mode is set to blend with alpha channel if you want to stack those two plates in media server. So now we'll take a chance to remind you that we changed the resolution of the setup only so we see things a little bit better. This is absolutely not needed when you're working on your virtual production scene. So I'm going to switch it back. So project, settings, rendering, I'm going to set it back to 1920 by 1080. And now I will head back to the root, and on the output render layer side by side, I will change no output composite. So this concludes the tutorial. This scene is ready now to be sent out to media server, and you can do that by going to project, compile block for media server. Thank you for watching this tutorial. See you in the next one.